Amara Lewis shifted her weight from one heel to the other, feeling the press pass swing lightly against her chest as she moved forward in line. The Grand Hyatt's main ballroom buzzed with nervous energy, a current running just beneath the polished surfaces and manicured smiles. She adjusted the strap of her leather satchel and exhaled slowly, willing her heartbeat to settle. The room itself was a study in controlled chaos. Rows of white chairs fanned out before a gleaming stage draped in navy and gold, the presidential seal flanked by thick American flags. Television lights glared down, bright enough to make the polished floorboards shine. Cameramen barked quick, technical phrases. Journalists, the seasoned and the ambitious alike, shifted in their seats, phones and recorders clutched like weapons. Amara found her assigned spot midway up the center aisle. Close enough to see the fine lines on faces, the way smiles tightened or cracked under scrutiny. She sat down carefully, smoothing the soft fabric of her navy dress, and placed her recorder on her lap. Around her, familiar faces nodded politely, the ones who knew her work, if not her name, and unfamiliar ones barely glanced her way. She liked it that way. Invisible was safer. For now. At the front of the room, the stage's edge bristled with aides and security detail, their earpieces discreet but unmistakable. Amara clocked them without turning her head, noting the stiff backs, the code words crackling softly into microphones. Control, always control. Everything here was a performance carefully calibrated to one man's ego. Her fingers brushed the small notebook tucked into her lap. On the first page, written in her smallest, neatest handwriting, were 3 questions. Only 3. She wasn't naive enough to think she'd get to ask all of them. If she was lucky, she might get one. Her thumb traced over the words: racial discrimination, policy consequences, personal responsibility. A man seated beside her, older, red tie knotted tight against his throat, cleared his throat pointedly. She caught the sideways glance he threw her, as if reminding her of something she had yet to forget. Know your place. She smiled politely, the way she always had, and turned her attention forward. The low murmur of the crowd swelled suddenly into cheers and a few scattered whistles. The man of the hour had arrived. Donald Trump moved to the podium with the self-satisfied swagger that cameras loved and critics despised. His tan was even more garish under the lights, his red tie impossibly bright. He beamed at the audience, waving, soaking in the adulation. Behind the grin was the same calculating look Amara had studied 100 times on television, in debates, in rallies, part performer, part predator. He adjusted the microphone, lips curling into a smirk. "Thank you, everybody. Thank you," he said, voice rich with practiced charm. "We're doing things nobody thought possible." Nobody. Applause thundered, some of it genuine, some mechanical. Amara kept her face neutral, recorder steady in her lap. She focused not on his words, which were the usual mixture of boasts and grievances, but on the reactions around her. How the man 2 rows ahead leaned forward, nodding eagerly. How a woman in a pearl gray blazer clutched her notebook tighter every time the applause swelled. How the planted supporters, easy to spot, shouted louder, laughing a little too hard at jokes that weren't funny. The first questions tossed at him were soft, predictable. "Mr. Trump, what are your plans for the new PAC? How will you defeat the fake news? What do you think about the latest poll numbers?" All asked with careful phrasing, with deference. He grinned, answered in slogans. The room relaxed, laughing in the expected places. The ritual of power played out, old and well-rehearsed. Amara waited. She listened. She thought of the notebook burning against her thigh, of the words she had chosen so carefully, knowing they would land like a stone dropped into a still pond. She felt her heart kick harder against her ribs. It would have been easy, so easy, to stay silent. To slip out of this room untouched, unseen, unchallenged. But that was never why she came. She straightened slowly as another softball was fielded, another easy answer tossed back. And then, as the next journalist hesitated, Amara lifted her hand. The moderator, a middle-aged man in a navy suit, frowned slightly when he saw her. His eyes flicked over her badge, hesitating for a breath too long. She held his gaze calmly. After a moment's pause, he gestured toward her. "You," he said. Amara rose to her feet. She felt every pair of eyes lock onto her as if the room had turned sharply toward a sound it hadn't expected. Her voice was steady, clear. "Mr. Trump," she said, "given the documented rise in racially motivated incidents during your presidency, How do you respond to criticism that your policies and rhetoric embolden discrimination? The room froze. And for a moment, Amara saw something flicker across Trump's face, not confusion, not even anger. Something older, deeper. Recognition. For a split second, the room hung in the silence after Amara's question, an inhale that hadn't yet decided whether it was going to be a laugh or a gasp. Then, Trump chuckled into the microphone. It wasn't the friendly chuckle of a man amused by a spirited debate. It was the slow, oily sound of someone preparing to humiliate, to remind everyone who held the floor. "That's cute," Trump said, leaning forward slightly. "Really cute." The audience laughed, not all of them, but enough. A brittle sound. Amara's hands stayed still at her sides. She could feel her heart hammering, but she didn't move. Trump's gaze sharpened, and he seized the moment like a dog snapping a bone. "You know," he said, his voice loud and hearty, "people like you should be grateful." He gave a wide, stagey smile. "Grateful to even have a job in journalism these days, with how bad it's gotten. You know what I mean." A few more laughs, a few hoots from the planted supporters. Amara did not react. She would not. "And here you are," Trump continued, voice dripping with mock concern, "stirring up hatred. Stirring it up. What a shame. Very sad." The words were carefully chosen. Not an outright slur. No, that wasn't how it worked anymore. It was the insinuation that was the weapon, that she was the problem, that she didn't belong, that her very existence as a black woman asking a question about racism was an act of aggression. "That journalist," Trump said, shaking his head theatrically. "Really bad. Fake news. That's what you are." Laughter again, louder this time. Some of it nervous. Amara's face remained impassive, but she could feel the blood rushing in her ears, the heat creeping into her chest. She could leave. Sit down. Look away. Pretend she didn't hear what everyone heard. Or she could stand there, still. She chose stillness. Trump, sensing that he wasn't breaking her, upped the ante. "And you know what?" he said, pointing directly at her now, the move almost cartoonishly aggressive. "You should be thanking people like me. I made this country better for everyone. Even you." The "even you" hit the room like a slap. "Even you. Even you." A few more cheers, but less certain this time. Amara heard the shift, not in the words, but in the space between them. She watched it happen. A woman a few rows up, lowering her eyes to her lap. A man in the press pit slowly closing his notebook without even realizing it. Trump stood taller, basking in the moment. "Instead, you come here with your nasty, race-baiting questions, trying to divide good Americans," he sneered. Good Americans. Another code, another blade slipped between the ribs. Amara inhaled once, slow and silent, and exhaled through her nose. Her hands did not shake. She refused to lower her gaze. She refused to fidget. She stood there, poised and motionless, the way her grandmother once taught her. If they try to shame you, let them drown in their own noise. The room around her began to shift again. The laughter that had seemed so easy, so performative, thinned. The claps faltered. An awkward, coughing sound broke the rhythm. A couple of journalists glanced sideways, as if suddenly unsure of what side they were supposed to be on. Trump's mouth moved, still saying something, some final jab, some low dig, but Amara barely heard it. Her pulse was a drumbeat, steady now. She had already made her choice. The last of Trump's words faded into the air like smoke. No applause followed. No cheers. Only the soft, restless rustle of bodies shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, the kind of sound people made when confronted with something too raw to laugh at, too ugly to pretend away. Amara stood rooted to the spot, still holding the moment steady. She felt the tension in the room shift from brash energy to brittle unease. She saw it in the subtle movements. A woman in a pearl necklace adjusting her scarf too many times. A man pretending to reread notes he hadn't touched all morning. The camera stayed trained on her. Somewhere, a lens zoomed in, catching every second of her unblinking gaze, every twitch of the president's mouth as he realized the room was not following him the way it usually did. Trump cleared his throat, forced a grin, shifted on his feet. Amara felt the victory, not the roaring, triumphant kind. No banners, no cheers. This was something harder, sharper. This was the victory of not bending. She let the silence stretch a heartbeat longer. A younger journalist a few rows ahead caught her eye, and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. A small, human flicker. Amara didn't respond. She couldn't afford to, but she felt it land, solid and true. Trump gave a tight, irritated laugh, the kind that barely masked his annoyance. "Next question," he barked, waving a hand dismissively. The moderator scrambled to regain control, his voice thinner now. He pointed to someone else, a man, older, white, who rose quickly, eager to divert attention, to smooth things over with a question about taxes or border walls. The performance lurched back into motion, but the wound remained. Amara sat down slowly, her body mechanical, careful not to show the trembling that started somewhere deep in her stomach and threatened to rise. She kept her expression blank as the older journalist beside her, the one who had side-eyed her earlier, shifted uncomfortably, coughing into his hand. The next questions were safe, boring, eager to move on, but they couldn't. Not really. The moment lived on in the silence that settled just a little heavier over every word that followed. In the stolen glances, the tight jaws, the careful phrasing. Amara leaned back in her chair, folded her hands neatly in her lap, and let the storm pass over her. She had survived it without firing a shot, and that, she thought, was the only answer some people would ever understand. The press conference wrapped faster than expected. Reporters, normally hungry for one last question, one last soundbite, now gathered their things with an urgency that had nothing to do with deadlines. A few supporters at the back gave half-hearted claps as Trump waved and disappeared behind the heavy curtains, trailed by his security detail. Amara stayed seated for a moment longer than necessary. She wasn't ready to stand yet, not while the air was still thick with something unspoken. Her fingers moved automatically, shutting off her recorder, slipping it into her bag with mechanical precision. The journalist beside her avoided eye contact. Others murmured in low voices, their words indistinct but their glances unmistakable. She stood finally, slowly, adjusting the strap of her bag. She moved with the careful grace of someone carrying something fragile inside them, something that couldn't afford to be dropped. As she made her way toward the exit, a few reporters peeled off to the side, suddenly engrossed in their phones or badges or conversations that hadn't existed 5 seconds before. No one reached out. No one said a word. But they watched her. Amara felt the stares sliding across her skin, prickling at the back of her neck, some curious, some guilty, some cold with thinly veiled contempt. Near the exit, a security guard, young, Latino, barely older than Amara herself, gave her a brief, respectful nod. His eyes met hers just long enough to say what words couldn't. "I saw it. I saw you." She nodded back, the smallest movement, then pushed through the doors into the thick, humid air of a Washington spring afternoon. Outside, the city noise washed over her, the muted rush of traffic, the distant hum of construction, the ordinary life she had, for a moment, left behind. Her phone vibrated in her bag. Then again, and again. Amara ignored it for now. She needed space, air between herself and what had just happened. She crossed the hotel courtyard, heels clicking softly against the stone, and found a bench half-shaded by a cluster of dogwoods in bloom. She sank down onto it, lowering her bag gently beside her. Only then did she let herself breathe. Her hands were shaking, just a little. She laced her fingers together, squeezing until the tremor stilled. In the distance, she could hear the faint siren of an ambulance, the bark of a street vendor hawking pretzels. Life, stubborn and ordinary, refused to pause for a moment. She pulled out her phone. Notifications exploded across the screen, news alerts, text messages, emails. Her name already trending. Video clips. Headlines. Trump attacks black journalist at press conference. Reporter stands tall in face of president's racist tirade. The silence that shamed the room. Amara's thumb hovered over the screen. Her throat tightened. This wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want to be a symbol, a headline, a cautionary tale, or a rallying cry. She just wanted to ask a question. A fair, necessary question. Her eyes blurred briefly. She blinked hard, forcing the tears back where they came from. There wasn't room for that. Not now. Not here. Amara sat stiffly on the bench, the weight of the phone in her hand heavier than it should have been. She scrolled. Every major outlet had picked it up. Every platform flooded with headlines, hashtags, commentary. The footage was everywhere. a short, brutal clip of a young black journalist standing silently while the most powerful man in the room tried, and failed, to reduce her to a caricature. Some voices praised her restraint. Others mocked it. Some demanded apologies from Trump. Others demanded explanations from her. The polarization wasn't surprising. Amara had covered politics long enough to know how quickly outrage fragmented into factions. But seeing her own face, frozen mid-silence, eyes locked on the podium, turned into a battleground was a different kind of knowing. Her email buzzed with interview requests, media inquiries, speaking offers. Names she recognized, networks that had previously ignored her pitches, editors who had passed on her stories without a word, now wanted her to share her experience, to be the voice of something larger. A familiar sour taste crept into the back of her throat. They didn't want her. They wanted the moment. They wanted the snapshot of bravery, the meme of defiance. They didn't want the whole of her, the sleepless nights, the self-doubt, the cold rage buried deep enough to keep her voice level under fire. The irony twisted in her chest. She had spent years training herself to be seen for her work, not her skin. And now, she was visible in a way that had nothing to do with her skills. Because of what he said. Because of how I stood there and took it. Her hand tightened around the phone. A message from her editor popped up. Proud of you. Take today off. We'll handle media requests. She stared at it for a long moment, her thumb hovering. Finally, she typed 2 words. No comment. And sent it. Not out of pride. Not out of stubbornness. Because she needed to remember who she was before the world decided what she had become. Another buzz. A text from her mother. I saw what happened. Come home if you need to. Proud of you, baby. Amara swallowed against the lump rising in her throat. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the spring air wash over her, carrying the distant sounds of the city, uncaring, unchanging. When she opened them again, the notifications were still there. The world was still waiting. But she wasn't ready to speak. Not yet. For now, it was enough to have stayed standing. It would have to be enough. The metro ride back to her apartment was mercifully uneventful. Amara tucked herself into a corner seat, her bag pressed against her side, headphones in without music playing. She watched the city blur past the window, neighborhoods stitched together by cracked sidewalks, kids in school uniforms, old men on stoops arguing about nothing. The ordinary rhythm of life, steady and indifferent to headlines. When she reached her stop, she moved quickly, keeping her head down. She wasn't worried about being recognized. Not yet, but she knew how fast attention could spread. Her building was an aging brownstone on a tree-lined street, quiet except for the occasional bark of a dog or the murmur of neighbors chatting on their stoops. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, unlocked her door, and slipped inside. The silence wrapped around her like a second skin. She dropped her bag by the couch and kicked off her shoes, sinking into the cushions with a groan. Her body ached, not from anything physical, but from the effort of holding herself together for so long. It was a different kind of exhaustion, the kind that started in the bones and crept outward. For a long time, she just sat there, staring at nothing. Her phone buzzed again. She flipped it over, screen down, silencing it. Across the room, her bookshelf caught her eye. A battered, uneven collection. Baldwin, Morrison, Coates, Lord. Voices she had grown up with, who had whispered to her in late nights and early mornings that the struggle was old, and it was hers too. She rose slowly, crossed the room, and pulled down a slim volume. The Fire Next Time. The pages fell open easily, worn from years of rereading. You can't fix what you won't face, Baldwin had written. Amara closed the book gently and sat back down. Face it. Stand in it. Don't let them decide who you are. Today, she had done that. Maybe imperfectly, maybe trembling inside. But she had done it. The cost was real. It always was. There would be people who twisted the moment. People who used it to further their own narratives. People who forgot her name even as they used her face. But there would also be others. The young woman somewhere in Baltimore who would see the clip and recognize herself. The boy in Atlanta who would realize that dignity didn't come from applause, but from refusing to bow. And maybe that was enough. Maybe it had to be. Amara leaned back, resting her head against the couch, and closed her eyes. Outside, the world moved on. Inside, she let herself be still. The knock came just after sunset. Amara frowned, glancing toward the door. She wasn't expecting anyone. She stood carefully, muscles stiff from hours of sitting, and crossed the room. Peeking through the peephole, she saw a woman in a sharp blazer, holding a tablet and a tote bag stamped with a major network's logo. Amara hesitated. Another knock. Light, polite, but insistent. She opened the door a few inches, keeping the chain latched. "Ms. Lewis?" the woman said, smiling professionally. "I'm Kara Hill. I work with Civic Media. We're incredibly impressed by your composure today. We'd love to discuss some opportunities with you." Amara stared at her. Kara hurried on, sensing hesitation. "Speaking engagements, maybe a book deal, a platform to share your story. You have a powerful brand right now, and a lot of people would love to hear more." A brand. Amara tasted the word, sharp and sour on her tongue. "I'm not interested," she said, voice even. Kara blinked, taken aback. "I understand it's overwhelming," she said quickly. "But you have a real chance to." "No," Amara said, more firmly this time. "I asked a question. That's all. I'm not a brand." Kara's smile faltered, a crack running through the professional mask. "But the visibility." Amara shook her head. "Not for sale." Kara stood there a moment longer, her polished certainty faltering. "Well," she said, backing away slightly, "if you change your mind." She slid a business card through the gap in the door. Amara didn't pick it up. She closed the door gently but firmly and slid the lock back into place. The weight of the exchange settled over her, but it felt lighter than she expected. She turned away from the door and walked back to the couch, back to the small pile of books waiting patiently on the coffee table. They didn't want her. Not really. They wanted the idea of her. And she wasn't interested in being anyone's idea. She picked up Baldwin again and flipped to another page, a new passage. "The world is before you, and you need not take it or leave it as it was when you came in." She smiled faintly, feeling something loosen in her chest. She would take the world, but on her own terms. Always on her own terms. The first light of morning slipped through the blinds, pale and tentative. Amara sat on her balcony, a chipped mug of coffee cradled in her hands. She wore an old sweatshirt and leggings, her hair loose around her shoulders, soft and unguarded. Below, the city stretched itself awake, delivery trucks rumbling down narrow streets, a dog barking somewhere in the distance, a jogger's rhythmic steps tapping against the pavement. Ordinary life. No flashing cameras. No viral headlines. Just breath and space and the slow, steady pulse of being alive. Her phone lay face down on the table beside her. She hadn't touched it since last night. The world could spin without her for a little while. She sipped her coffee slowly, letting the heat settle inside her. She thought about the girl she used to be, the one who scribbled questions in the margins of her school books, dreaming of asking them in rooms where the answers mattered. She thought about the woman she was now, older, sharper, scarred in places no one could see. Both were still here. Both had made the same choice. Not to shout, not to flinch, just to stand. The cost had been high. It always was. There would be doors that closed quietly in the weeks ahead, opportunities that evaporated without explanation. There would be names muttered in backrooms, labels assigned to her in places she couldn't reach. Too emotional, too divisive, too much. But there would also be something else. A girl somewhere who would see the clip late at night when she needed it most. A boy sitting in a classroom who would realize that dignity wasn't about being liked. It was about being unbroken. And Amara would know, in the marrow of her bones, that none of them were alone. She breathed in the morning air, sharp with the scent of spring. The world would keep spinning, and she would keep standing. Always.